Firstly, 50 points of setup, then explaining why we get better papers overall, then explaining why we get more faith in academic institutions and fields of research, and finally explaining why this increases the accessibility of academic papers. Firstly, on the setup. First thing I'd like to say here is the main the main areas in which this will exist and in which it will have an impact is things like the social sciences. This is for the reason that these are places where words are the large majority of what they do. They're the places where Sokal papers can actually exist and actually impact the most. And necessarily they're the things that often rely on using lots of heavy use of terminology and things that therefore allow you to engage in sort of clouding your judgment and putting in a punch of paper, as I will continue to refer to. Secondly, how this happens. Obviously this is a plot, we think this is the most intuitive and likely way this gets used. We think the government gets academics to produce these, they make them actively produce something that has no value and produces no actual argument, and they force them to be into silence, and then someone will reveal why it happens. Secondly, they use AI to produce papers and put those into these places. And then thirdly, we think that there's going to be a punishment. No. So, firstly, there's going to be funny cuts that occur in terms of punishment, but secondly as well as that, there's just an accountability metric. In fact, it gets revealed to the public if it gets through, but also it gets revealed if it gets blocked. It gets shown in this paper that this journal did have the ability to block this. I'll take a clarification now.
Why wouldn't this happen in science when already things like e-hacking are happening? Why is it only related to social sciences?
It could happen there as well, sure, but we think the large majority of cases in which this would occur would be other places. Notably, those are the places where it is easiest to catch because these are the places words are useful. Obviously, there are other ways of engaging and stopping e-hacking, but that's not necessarily within the metric of this debate. So now, firstly, on why this results in better papers. Noting here the context is there are lots of things. There is a prevalence of ChatGPT and increasing use of AI, as well as that there is just a publish or perish model, which means that people are more likely to put in papers that are bad, resulting in an increase in punch of papers as we continue to go on. So, firstly, why people writing these papers are able to publish shit papers that produce nothing. Three things. Firstly, we think there are simply lots of papers, and it is simply hard to look through all of them to an in-depth extent to be in the way that things are broken out in terms of the way that the profit metric of a journal doesn't produce that incentive. Secondly, there's just rep bias that exists, which means that people who do have lots of rep in the academic community are able to publish these papers and get those through because people look at the name and publish it anyway. Thirdly, journals simply want lots of papers within their journal, so as a result are likely to inflate and lower the bar and entry into their journals. So then secondly, why do we get more accountability? And this is to explain why there's a change in the profit metrics for journals, that mean they're more likely to focus on things accountability metrics for each paper. Firstly, papers are just looked through more rigorously. Journals are more likely to peer review everything and to a much greater extent for the reason that when something gets through, it looks significantly bad on a journal, so they have an incentive to invest in this kind of thing. Secondly, people will be caught now when they do write bad papers. Noting here that while the increase in peer review both catches bad papers that are produced by this new thing that the government is doing, but it also catches the things being produced by specific authors themselves. So journals are much more likely to look at these things. The third thing to say is that people now invest a lot in AI detection and things like that, which we think hugely increases and produces lots of benefits for journalists that stops the use of AI, which I think is negative. That explains why papers get better. Now, secondly, on why we get more faith in institutions in fields of research. A couple of things here. Firstly, existing Sokal papers are often done maliciously. They're used to make entire fields look untrustworthy or bad. This looks like when they were used, like the example of Sokal was used to completely discount social science itself, or they are used against things like feminist. So at the point where we now create more accountability, we also stop these papers from getting through, which means we increase the amount of faith in the institutions. Noting here that when the government does this, it is not done maliciously towards the entire field itself, but instead it's only done to the journal itself, which we think is a much better model than existing to the way that Sokal papers exist currently. So that explains why there's more why you don't get the harm of Sokal papers being used maliciously. But secondly, I think people just have more faith in the institutions themselves, because the journal now, when they pass the test and when they think gets blocked, necessarily get the badge of approval of that fact, which means they get more, which means that people have more faith in any paper that comes from them. Do you think is a good thing? Having faith in academic institutions is something that is beneficial. Noting here, we get faith in good academic institutions, not all academic institutions, because that includes bad ones as well. Sure.
Yeah. You say this debate is about the arts. Obviously, what does a bogus arts paper look like? Isn't it just a theory the publisher doesn't believe in?
No, so necessarily, the way that it works is often these are things where you don't have any serious line of logic, or as well as this, these are things that are just produced maliciously, but people use AI because they don't want to actually bother writing a paper and they want to collect a paycheck. We necessarily think those are the kind of things we are stopping. We stop papers that don't produce a line of argument, don't produce any substantial change. But as well as that, there is a significant amount of papers to the extent that necessarily there is going to be a publisher that would accept your viewpoint. So if you're going to stand up and say this stops minority viewpoints from getting through, there are enough papers that actually that is unlikely to be a way to actually actually works. So now finally, on why we get higher access to papers are just more accessible for people to read and look through. This is for the reason that currently lots of the ways that people write papers is with highly technical language that is not accessible to the normal person. And necessarily at the point where you do have these like much higher checks and balances on these things, if you have more people looking through for clear lines of argument, it creates a huge incentive for authors themselves, if they want their papers to get published, to look good to each journal. Necessarily then, there's going to be like a push towards them to have much clearer lines of arguments. This means they're going to use more language that is more accessible, that is more understandable, because when you use lots of technical language and you use lots of buzzwords, you sound a lot like what AI-generated scripts look like. And this means that people have an incentive now to produce things that are more accessible, which means that then we get a greater increase of access to papers. The reason this is beneficial is it means that more people are able to read these papers and understand the things that come from them. More people are able to access things like feminist literature in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. But as well as that, you have more access and integration between normal society and academic papers. That also means you're more likely to get academic papers that are tailored towards normal society's needs, rather than what currently exists, where it's sort of like a bit of like academics only talking to each other, which we think is harmful in and of itself. So overall, what you should take from the speech is a couple of things. Firstly, we just directly increase the quality of academic papers. We result in more rigorous peer review. We result in more doing more in-depth research into each individual paper, looking for a line of argument that makes sense, looking for the fact that the author themselves wrote it and they didn't use something like AI to do it. Secondly, though, we get typically much higher faith in institutions and fields of research overall. Not only here, we avoid the harms of Sokal papers in the way that they currently exist, which is something that is used maliciously, because we force institutions to develop a sense of accountability, which stops them getting through in the first place, but as well as that, provide a benefit itself, because we give each journal necessarily a stamp of approval that shows that they are a trustworthy journal that produces papers that are good. So we necessarily get the benefit of the high faith in each academic paper itself, but finally we also just increase the access to each paper, which means we notably get better papers, more people are accessing and understanding these papers, and more people just have faith in the overall papers and the institutions that they stand for themselves. For those reasons, it is a clear Gov win. Four things in the speech. Firstly, why there's never an imperative. Secondly, why it's harder to pass new ideas and why this is detrimental to academia. Thirdly, why we think governments probably are the best actors. And fourthly, why this totally reduces faith in academia. Firstly, why was there no imperative? You must first understand that Sokal was not peer-reviewed, and people knew that Sokal was not peer-reviewed. That is, it could have easily been fixed, and it was an issue. The thing of it being malicious was something else the public was aware of. Sokal is then publicly kind of automatically punished by like market forces. That is like other people, literally people on the internet, little punters talking on their little forums and stuff can talk about this, but also assumably other like academic journals want to call out things like this just because of these competition incentives. That's why you actually didn't need it in the first place. But even like the examples that OG give are like quite silly. For example, AI, like obviously AI detectors exist, and things like using big buzzwords probably is like unlikely in the way they suggest, just because AI just uses the words that are commonly used because it's a generative language model. And I think people can generally tell, like your teachers can probably tell when you use AI because it just sounds different to how normal people write and how academics write. You actually can't write an academic article. But also no, journals just probably had an incentive to never allow things like this to ever happen. Why is that? Like, if you are a journal and you're producing something like the Sokal paper, which, as you say, is like malicious and trying to like destroy this entire field, obviously that like destroys the business of the academic paper. Like, if you just destroy gender studies and you're like you're an academic journal which focuses in gender studies, like why would you do that? Obviously they have incentives to have good quality papers because that also has financial rewards for them. And like reputational rewards. That is why this is not going to happen. Finally, like they say, it will make things like more understandable, language easier. Well, firstly, this is just like not really true. The reason why academic articles use quote unquote big words is because you have to use specific terminology to be more precise. When you dumb it down into things that are really simple, this just washes down the actual meaning. You don't get the nuance, and nuance is what's really important and allows new ideas. Sure.
So you need specific words to get the nuance and specificity of a claim. Why not just examine the specificity and use the longer words as opposed to using the filler word?
It's more precise. Sure you can make it more simple, but this is like the weakest, like most speculative like benefit you have here. Like is actually like very unimportant here. Like what would we do like instead to make things better? Like we just either like support like making it more visible if your article like you're producing is peer reviewed or not, and like we would just kind of focus, the government should probably just focus on making things more rigorous. For instance, things like publishing the method of the experiment before it is conducted. That is, then you can't like change, like say your method like did not produce the conclusion you wanted, and like your aim is now incorrect. Now people can't change what their initial hypothesis was. Things like that can help reduce like mismanagement and stuff, and just like reliability is like the ability to be more replicable. These are obviously much better than kind of government punishing these in this way. So, second thing, why is it much harder to pass new ideas, and why is that so terrible? I think what this does is just exacerbate like the fear that people and academics already have when having a new idea, and I think the repercussion is particularly harmful in the arts. Firstly, just note, there's probably like no exact objective right of like what is and what isn't like a good art paper. But also, I think what happens then is that you just rehash old ideas and at the loss of like new important ideas. Note there's already existing risk in art because it is very speculative. I think what happens now is that you just repackage existing papers and make it sound slightly different, but the high risk of doing something new that maybe doesn't have the peer or like doesn't have like the backing up of like 30 years of like the same ideas is obviously going to be totally destroying creativity. For example, you needed to have new, speculative, potentially questionable ideas. Things like, you know, speaking of gender or queer theory, that was perhaps long time ago questionable or like, you know, dangerous, but those are really important ideas because it allows like a society to progress and transgress against what we have in the past. Those are really important changes that are now barred from happening because these new ideas are like too speculative. What do we think that these academic journals are probably going to be doing in these cases? For instance, when you are like a blind peer, when you have like not blind peer review, that is you know who the person is, these academic journals are probably going to deny you more than otherwise. Why is that? Just because there is a risk that this new like person that you don't know could be another punter like Sokal, and we probably want to avoid that. No thank you. And that is why it exacerbates it in the sense that the existing academics just stay in there and they stay producing the article, stay producing the same ideas. That was really detrimental in academia as a whole, and we would much rather allow like the new ideas to become better. And third thing, why are like government probably just like not the best actors? I think this is like simple in the sense that governments just probably should be divorced from something like as objective as academia. Like firstly, even if you don't believe that the government will intervene in a bad way, there's obviously a public perception here that is like, oh, the government has like vetted or like slightly like manipulated these papers to like do this certain thing. I think the trust that you have in academia is eroded in that sense. But I think also there are obviously some, like the types of things that governments would be testing may just be like political or like to try and test like what the type of people, what the beliefs which like their voter base kind of believes. Or it could just like trying to be like testing the waters of other things. Or they could just be like manipulating things. We don't really know. Government and academic bodies just should be separate. Final thing to be said here is why does this reduce faith in academia? They tell you this improves faith in academia, but we'll tell you why it's worse. Firstly, you know, as OG tells you, the government is very publicly going to be announcing that a specific like journal has done something bad. So the government doesn't actually need to be malicious here, because what it did, it questioned the credibility of not only that journal, but other journals. This was a really bad thing, because it meant that, firstly, for that specific journal, this is just maybe like one bad paper, and now there are a lot of good ideas, a lot of good like academics within that journal that just can't produce anything anymore. But secondly, you lose trust in academia generally because you do not trust it as an institution which is always correct, which like you know has credibility. What this leads to then is that you know more misinformation comes around because you now supposedly can't trust academia as a source of information. You kind of are then resulted to like believing like the things that you hear on the internet, which we obviously don't have. Things like peer review, which make it really, really important for knowledge. What do you believe at the end of this debate? Firstly, there actually just wasn't a need for this. Secondly, new ideas just aren't going to be happening, and that is severely detrimental. Governments are probably going to be doing this badly, and the amount of faith and involvement in academia is going to be so much worse for those reasons. So much for the pros.
start to dispatch firstly on whether there was an imperative, because we give you a lot of reasons to explain there isn't. We explain to you that journals have a proper incentive that relies on you publishing things that people believe and going back to them and paying for subscriptions. We explain to you that the individuals on the boards that decide what gets through in general care about academics because that's how they've risen to that place. We explain to you that peer review works quite well in the majority of instances. We can make it better, clarity, fix it without a counter model. We also explain to you that like anything that they said about AI is symmetric, that we, in our counter model, from our lower set, that we're going to also mandate that AI detection. So then, what should you believe? I think there's a relatively small problem that opening government wants to fix. Let's now see how, like, what harms happen when they try and do that. First thing, on the quality of these papers. Because OG frames this debate around the arts, but that reveals the first way they lose. Because the implication is that they preserve truth and objectivity, but that necessarily only works in sciences, where you can have a flawed hypothesis, where you can publish bad data and lies. Obviously, publishing a bogus paper in the arts necessarily just means publishing a paper that you don't believe with. And the problem there is that that article is probably just something that is new, probably has some other value. See how new many of the social sciences are, probably there is new merit to new ideas. The problem is they're never going to just stop having bad articles published, because we explain to you a change of calculus that happens in the publisher firstly, which is that they don't want to get literally fucked over by the government and their name torn through mud, and so they're less likely to publish any article that has a new idea that isn't what's been regurgitated 100 times before, anything that is innovative, and that was harm in and of itself. But even if you don't believe the publishers are going to be like steer away from these things because the ideas are like super absurd. First problem, if the arguments are super absurd, like the Sokal papers, they literally don't have a benefit for the very simple reason that those publishers, the Sokal paper and the info slide, was believed by literally no one. There was no harm to society. But secondly, right, even if the publisher doesn't care about those things, the perception of academics wanting to get published definitely changes. Because as an academic, you're pressured to be published because that is how you progress in your career. Because you spend literally like weeks and long amounts of time and effort into your papers. So you want to make sure you're publishing something that won't get rejected. And so at the point at which they reinforce what's happening now, make it even worse, but the only way to get published is to remain safe and not have new ideas. You deter them from having new ideas. And that's our claim as to how we get the improved quality of paper. Their only response is just to talk about AI. As I've explained, that's symmetric and out of the debate. Their only other claim then, on like why this is better for the quality of papers, is that they now detect AI. The counter model explains that like that their model is not necessary to have the benefit of catching AI. There are much more efficient ways to do it, where you can just mandate that journals do so. No thank you. Final thing here then. Actually, yeah, and so that's the first way we want to debate. On to then society, the way these papers are received. The first thing they say is that papers are likely to become more accessible because they're not trying to sound like AI. That is literally their only mechanism. So first response, counter model symmetric. But secondly, I think it sounds like a bit of a trade-off that you probably shouldn't be willing to make, because buzzwords in academia literally are just being concise and precise to the people that you are communicating to. Their response to this, and this is the third response, is like, oh, what's the point of a journal if like your average layperson can't understand it? Obviously, the point of academics is to like come up with knowledge and build that to other academics in their specialized fields. The way that is communicated to the general public that doesn't want to know what neoliberalism is just every other type of information ever. Things like books and like papers that and like things that like read The Economist or something. Like no need to read journals if it's too hard for you. The final thing we do here is we flip this claim, because our first claim on how we're better for society explains that when this is published, people distrust all academia. Their only response is to just be like, no, they're just going to distrust that journal. But that's not how people engage with academia. Your average person on the street does not know the names of like 3 journals. What they're going to do is see that, one, the government is cracking down on this, and therefore there must be a big problem with fake things. Or they're going to see the government is intervening and just trust the government interfering with academics. Or finally, they're just going to perceive when there is a headline that says something so stupid was published that all of that field has no credit. And that means your everyday person is less receptive to those new ideas and to things. And that is how we're firstly better for society. Their only real push here is like symmetry. They're like, oh, Sokal papers are already done by not the government. First response, obviously they're rare. This doesn't break the debate. They happen more on your side, and we argue that that is worse. But secondly, government interference exacerbates the harms I explained. Because it fuels conspiracy nuts, because people think that when the government intervened, there is a massive problem with these fake papers being published now, and that was really bad. Final thing here, firstly, on government intervention, our second way to win this claim. We explain that academia should be separate because it's about knowledge and that it's too much power for the government to have. A homophobic government could mandate, would have to mandate this policy in their world, and that leads to a lot of harms. OG doesn't prove these governments are likely to do it well. They don't have fiat to explain what a government describes as a bad paper in the arts, when we explain that is an exceptionally arbitrary line. So what we explain to you is you're more likely to have governments dismissive of queer theory, and in case you're thinking, oh, isn't that symmetric? Maybe to a large extent, but it obviously happens worse to the point at which you mandate governments to do these things. That is a harm. Finally then, within STEM, actually don't have time. Yeah, opening.
Do you think a paper that is internally inconsistent and lacks its line of argument is a meaningfully new idea that benefits academic research?
Okay, but if your point is that these arguments are stupid, you failed to prove a harm. Because no one actually thought that gravity isn't real, it's just language, and so there's no real reason to stop them from being published when they are. Weigh that against the harms we explained to you when you scare people off making those new ideas, when you have society less trustful of these fields in the first instance. Obviously, if that's your case, you've shrunk the debate, but we still win. Finally then, on academics, we explained to you that young academics are going to be dismissed unfairly. That means you have fewer people entering the field, and that's a harm. Their only response is to be like, oh no, just put the name of an academic. Firstly, if you do this without consent, that is a principal violation. That is literally tarnishing their name, because not everyone that sees the fake article will see that it was a Sokal paper, but also you can likely get sued for that, which explains why governments are unlikely to do it that way, more likely to just make up names, and explains why we get our harm on young academics. But if you are doing it with consent, it probably explains that it's super expensive. Oh, whatever, I don't care. So, note then, even if you don't believe all of that though, everything else I said stands without that argument about new journalists struggling to break through, because we explained the way this changes the decision-making calculus of both journalists and of academics. Final thing in the speech then, peer review will never pass these things anyway, which explains there is no problems, but I'm going to say one thing. Peer review is really rigorous, and anything CO says that is different to that is a knife and should be dismissed as such. For those reasons, vote over.
What OG misses on in this debate is what this initial intro slide was about. It's about the sciences. When OG comes out and say that when we're talking about Sokal, we're overwhelmingly talking about social sciences, and it immediately concedes, oh yeah, but sciences are really important too, they miss out on a really interesting part of analysis, and that's what's going to be our extension to that. So why is focusing on Sokal papers in the sciences more important than the arts? A lot of science papers simply go uncited. Around 10% of all papers never get a citation, and about 90% never get above 10 citations. Why is that really bad? Well, one science fields like psychology, biology, physics, chemistry requires a huge amount of special equipment, materials. Science is very overwhelmingly government funded. I think compared to every other possible discipline in university, science is just overwhelmingly funded. You often need live subjects or participants, and there's generally an enormous amount of time from a huge amount of researchers. Also, a lot of scientific research in chemistry and physics requires a lot of interdisciplinary work. What does this all mean? Probably it's very fair to say that your average scientific paper probably has a huge amount of cost in making, and that really simple procedural or methodological errors that may occur are caught under a Sokal system. Why? Because journals are more incentivized when they look at scientific papers to see where are the methodological failures. They don't necessarily have to completely redo the testing itself, but they're probably more likely to catch where methodological errors occur, where very obvious logical leaps happen. That is why we simply have more of a benefit by using Sokal papers to focus on making sciences better. There's also huge benefits for institutions, society, and helping with information as a whole. First, on the benefits for science institutions. one, this enables governments to find where there's significant opportunity cost in terms of funding at different science faculties. If there's a huge, if scientific institutions or journals publishing papers that are very clearly like methodologically or obviously flawed, there's probably something fundamentally wrong with those institutions, especially considering just the sheer amount of capital it requires to create this lab, to create these Sokal papers. What does this mean? One, the government is given a reason to investigate these institutions and these specific universities. They're doing quite a poor job of catching these bullshit, these poor quality papers, which means they can either audit these institutions to make them better. They could put some sort of pressure on them to improve the quality of their like scientific process, wherever, and they also can reclaim significant amount of opportunity cost and revenue. What like external benefits does this have? One, a lot of the institutions making science papers are stuff like universities, and probably having better scientific methods at a university will probably in some way flow down to make like university degrees better, at the very least like postgrad working in the sciences feel better or have a better experience, which is produce better research outcomes, which is a huge net benefit. Second of all, one huge problem, and it's kind of brought up by opening opposition, is, well, what about conspiracy theorists? Well, the current problem at the time is people cite really poor quality scientific papers and journals. For example, the very original paper about like vaccines causing autism was complete bullshit, but actually put into a proper like proper journal and like proper journal, despite the fact that how like severe methodological flaws in that study. However, conspiracy theorists can still go back and use really poor quality research papers to a large extent in order to push whatever like anti-vax conspiracy theories they believe in. On our side of the house, by pushing these Sokal papers, what you force is you force these institutions to actually critically evaluate the different studies that are coming in, which reduces the amount of these bullshit pilot studies, what is like obviously methodologically flawed, in a second, methodologically flawed studies, which leads to a decrease in ammunition for conspiracy theorists. Now, we'll point out conspiracy theorists will believe in whatever they believe for whatever reason they want. There's not really much we can do, but at the very least, we can take away a little bit of legitimacy by them by forcing journalists to more critically evaluate the large volumes of papers that are coming through. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, only peer-reviewed papers in science have any merit, and if you do publish bad science, people will prove it wrong because that's a great way for them to gain rep. That means that the Gov case is worse in the context of sciences. I would say distrust in science and having less innovation in science, massive harms.
I think, like, first of all, you're framing like there's a huge industry in like disproving scientific papers. It's just not true. I'm pretty sure there's a huge problem in the sciences right now that people are simply not that interested in either reproving previous groundbreaking scientific papers or proving new scientific papers. Again, on the autism example, there's probably like that one autism study about vaccines causing autism is probably like one of the most unironically influential studies ever in terms of like people's thinking and manpower. But like no one actually cares or thinks about the papers that disprove it. Similarly, there's been also like similar cases with that study that like claimed that Alzheimer's was caused by some protein that ended up being like completely digitally altered that now has a very like a huge damaging long-term effect based on the overall state of Alzheimer's. So we don't really think this is necessarily like characteristically true. Now onto like some points made by Earl, just in response. First, art papers are inherently and it's an inherently probably subjective field, and we can't make many good takeaways. Yeah, this is probably true. This is why overall like science is probably an easier area to target, and we can probably get more obvious direct benefits. Because at the end of the day, like how do you write bullshit arts papers? All of them are kind of at least a little bit bullshit. Well, when I read that prompt, I was like, yeah, you know, I can see like a philosophy student writing about how like all physics is actually language in like some sort of like three-dimensional way. Meanwhile, in the sciences, we can probably it's probably a lot easier to make logical connections between the logical failures of like people's specific methodology, or like failures in just simply analyzing data or doing regressions and shit like that. So we win simply the fact that our metrics to win were to show a significant benefit are just a lot more clear than open in government. And finally, this like the opposition tried making this like really like point about like, oh well, in the prompt they said this wasn't peer reviewed, it was just a single expert, as if like a single expert like recommending or super boosting a specific paper or topic doesn't have a massive amount of influence on like the acceptance of that topic. I'm pretty sure that Einstein was alive for the autism cause vaccines cause autism paper and was like, this is true. That paper would probably have a huge amount of legitimacy for whatever reason. So I don't really see why this is such a big one. Thank you.
Two extensions from CO. Firstly, why this restricts the free flow of ideas, and then secondly, why state interference is likely going to be used in a bad way. Just clarifying the frame, I hate to do this at CO, but I just do not think this debate is about reputable journals that already do peer review, simply because, as Ogo points out, reputable journals like Nature already have such rigorous publishing standards, yet they point out this, but they also have reputational costs associated with it because they care about the number of citations. They literally have a cult following. I have a professor whose goal in life is to get published in Nature Immunology. This is not where the debate takes place, and I think it's also pointing to the info slide, the Sokal paper literally directly targeted a journal that did not do peer review. So this debate is about papers that do not do peer review, niche journals that our contention on CO is that these are so uniquely valuable and you ought to have a space for them in academia. Why do we think these niche journals are uniquely valuable? Simply because they allow for the publishing of views that are not directly aligned with the mainstream. They are often more radical, they are often more subversive in a way that is really uniquely important to have positioned in the marketplace of ideas. Note, I want to preempt that this is not hate speech and things like that because they can easily be sense-checked by any sort of journal that would not want to publish them, but they are subversive ideas, as we heard in feminist ideas that literally are countercultural, but because they espouse true claims about gender, they tend to stick and to, at the very least, contribute to the public discourse. So our contention is that now these niche journals will have to tighten their belt because of all the punitive measures that OG points to, financial punishments, but also just being discredited at large. Whilst they would have only had a small viewer base, a small but very important viewer base, now they're going to be the target of widespread public scrutiny in a way that means that they cannot just do the important work that they do. This is particularly bad about minorities. Claims that this is bad for minorities, but we're going to make out why specifically this is an important space for them, notably because peer review is so rigorous as OO claims. It means that a lot of developing nations and institutions there literally do not have the capacity to engage in the rigorous process of peer review. This looks like submitting your paper to a journal, getting rejected, submitting it again to a journal, getting rejected, submitting it again, being like, oh, we might conditionally allow you to go past if you make all of these revisions. You make those revisions, it gets rejected. It's such an arduous process, I know personally. So it means that the people who are the worst off literally do not have the ability to engage in, to access peer review papers in the first place, but also they just often have not been educated in a way that makes their research amenable to these peer review papers. Often they require strict structure. I would note that structure is a uniquely Western concept that a lot of people just do not have concepts of elsewhere. But also because they often have narrow scopes, they do not want anything to be fundamentally contradictory to what is already the mainstream and those sorts of things. And they just do not have any reputation or funding to be able to produce work that would be accepted by peer review. This is all to say that minorities are systemically locked out of peer review papers, and this is a unique way to get their foot in the door, to get some publishing expertise to have this entry point, or just to get their important work validated so that they can ask for more grants and more funding, hopefully to do more better work. And it's definitely really important for, as I alluded to earlier, radical ideas like feminist theories and things like that. Even if they are bad theories, they contribute to the discourse because they prompt thought in a way that is so meaningful. Note that this is different to the manufactured theories of the Sokal papers that OG wants to populate into the marketplace of ideas because they are literally bullshit. They do not advance any causes in a way that is productive. Weigh this super highly because now you offer choice to people, you offer options to people who would be knocked out of these peer-reviewed journals. You allow for like dissemination of really important ideas to have some credence to them and validate their work. I'll actually take you guys.
So you don't need peer review to stop a Sokal paper. They're logically inconsistent. It simply takes actively reading them. Why does doing that take so much capital? I mean, you're not able to do it. And obviously, new ideas are consistent and wouldn't be stopped by looking for Sokal papers in your journal.
The point is that people will overreact because you're going to be so punitive. They will just lower the threshold of, actually higher the threshold of what they will accept in a way that is punitive. Secondly, now on state interference. OG is quite charitable and says that states will act in good faith and still harms will accrue. We're going to tell you specifically why states are going to act in bad faith once this precedent is set, once this is regular practice. And the context to note here is, I guess the conservative rhetoric has gotten popular support simply because it espouses anti-elite sentiment. They voice grievances that are legitimate grievances, like losing your social esteem because you are not a white-collar worker, because the university acts as a sorting machine, all those things. But they weaponize this in a post-truth context now, whereby genuine criticisms against their leadership are just rejected in the news cycle. And this is really bad. And this is a sticking point. A lot of people actually believe this because these leaders espouse this sort of sentiment and they have trust in this electoral official. The empirical example here is that the most trusted news channel is now the Weather Channel, and then you have all of these confirmation bias metrics that mean you just believe bullshit. This happens in the news cycle and it's super bad. Now we're going to integrate academia into this sort of post-truth context in a way that is really bad. How would this work? We would say that it's not unlikely that conservative leaders will use this now to discredit liberal theories. How can they do this? They can literally call out any paper that doesn't agree with their views as Sokal papers and say that this is actually illegitimate claims, or they can saturate the market now with articles that are just favorable to their side. Know that they would pick journals that would likely pass their papers because they know that they don't do peer review, meaning that if they get called out, they'll just be like, oh, it was a Sokal paper anyway, meaning that now you are literally populating the academia with all of this nonsense in a way that allows them to regain their strength in a way that literally discredits academia. This is the biggest impact of this debate.
Wonderful. I thank the opposition member for that speech, and I welcome the government whip to conclude the government bench.
So, talk about extension briefly, and then I'll move on to, cut bench, and then we'll talk about other things. So, first on extension, just essentially on the fact that, we actually, I think we've got a lot of responses to it, so basically just talk about it more. I think, benefits kind of feel that, science is kind of rather easy to, figure out what a Sokal paper is, maybe a bit more easily, because it's kind of science is, for the most part, cold hard fact, where obviously you have, experimentation, you do new things, you test new theories, and try to get to a better place, and, develop things in the future, etc., right? But obviously there's a line of, having, actual data and figuring out what is, true or false, and that barrier is rather easily, no one's, really contested the fact that we can, pretty much get these benefits of having these things look better, and in notes our opening, they really talk about this, they focus more on arts, right? I think that obviously that is not some importance, we outweigh them in terms of we get way more benefit in this as we get this benefit of having actually way more benefit to ourselves in the sense of we just have way just it's scientific, we just have way more development, way better. Something that's unclear, how no one else gets this. Now it's onto off bench. Opening they just kind of talk about
Quite a bad distinction.
yes.
Do you agree with OG when they say that the whole peer review thing, it's only after peer review that so-called papers will be banished?
I think it's just like, it's so calculated when like, it's like after peer review and it's just like, it's like intentionally like bad, right? And then you just like, it's like intentionally a paper with like no logic to it and you just have to figure out it's basically that. Anyway, so like opposition, they just take it, like they talk about how there's no imperative and how essentially, like there is like no objective and how like, you just be able to and they just try like, oh yeah, like their main push is just kind of like, well, like, like people just like won't publish things now because they're just getting scared of like publishing that's really bad. I think that's kind of the point, right? You actually like have to really quickly think about like what you're able to publish, right? And not publish really actually offensive stuff, things like no Americans are like intentionally bad people, right? And then like, obviously like we want people to publish things that are like a bit out or a bit like outside of the comfort zone and actually like push us to like a better place, right? I think it's rather clear there's a line between that, right? It's unclear that like people would be like too like just like they'll see a paper that has like a word they don't like oh no, we can't publish. I think like people actually understand and then like the government is actually able to be like figuring out like and what is good or not and actually know. We think the government is actually able to figure out precisely like what actually is good and the government has resources to do this, right? And further on like they talk about how like oh, you're going to keep producing ideas, and that's untrue. It's actually it's like constantly pushing forward to have better ways of doing this, right? And then like, isn't like the government should be the best idea to do this? And like my question to you is like, which actually should be doing it? Because I feel like our journals just like perfectly able to like margin themselves, really not, otherwise we wouldn't have this discussion. And further on, like how like you're gonna like reduce fake and all this stuff and how including malicious like. But it's like how really like you just kind of think of like, it's also about how like, now it's kind of question which journal that you can, I think that's kind of the whole point, but you need to like figure out in like this world, like who you can actually figure out who you actually can trust, right? Because like you shouldn't just like blindly trust something like that. You just what's good about this, like you actually figure out like what specific is like you should be able to like figure out. And then we talk about like kind of how like publishers get scared, and that's kind of their main point about maybe we're gonna get like more accountability and stuff.
OG makes this debate about logically incoherent journal papers. Our harms about journals being more dismissive and academics being less innovative to play safe still stand. Does either team on the Gov bench prove a harm if insane papers no one believes are published? Right now.
I can't exactly figure out what you're saying, which might be on me, but like, sorry. Anyways, like onto closing, onto the other, just like talking also about like reputation and then we just feel like it's so clear how like he specifically published to like a journal that like had no peer review, and like our point that like that makes sense, right? Because he was trying to make a point that like people don't like look at what they read, right? And it's just like that's the whole point, right? People don't actually look at the things, they just publish whatever, they just do whatever to like get by. We think like that's the whole point. Like you need to be looking critically about like what you publish and what you consume, right? Like that's literally our entire point, and all these benefits that we get when you look at an app member is clearly there in our attention. And it's like moving on, we'll talk about how like small journals are going to get like really bad and publish these stuff and all this stuff like. And I think like also talk about things like people like unable to work in structure. I think that's what they're saying. Like our point is like you can work in structure because like we're able to like do this because like if you just like try and do a paper that like is done correctly, done like by correctly I mean you do it like the right way in the sense like you don't try to make things up, right? You try to have people that's like logically consistent. Even if you like try to that doesn't say like, oh I have all the answers, but sorry, no. You just say a paper that's just like that makes sense. You might not be like, oh I know exactly how quantum physics works. You can be like, I know this, I know this. You don't have to like do everything, right? You just don't have to be like a complete shitbag who just makes things up. Like that's like the line that she's trying to draw in this debate. Like further on, talk about how like states are like having like a bad faith, which is like kind of extends on like what their opinion does. Anyways, they talk about how conservative, like anti-league sentiment, etc. And I think it's just like kind of like, oh yeah, also how conservatives just like make stuff up and like throw in they don't like the Sokal paper. I think that's like really easily disproved because if something is like actually not a Sokal paper, you can tell, right, these Sokal papers are kind of designed to be somewhat true, but like there's clearly a part of them that is like insane, which makes it very distinguishable. So it's like unclear how conservatives like which is like in this like post-truth world, which they try to point out, like and like do this like horrendous generation. And like, anyways, on top of that, we just think we provide the greatest like concrete benefit in like in the sciences and having like Sokal papers actually like prove which like institutions actually do the best. I think you're out of time. Anyways, I think it's very clear to us that like we actually provide the greatest benefit out of everyone's debate, and we think like like on off, they just kind of like have this, like, sorry. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Three, two, one. It's very weird I'm having to do this in Opway, but I don't think OG is model in that sense, and by extension CG's case either. 3 reasons for this. First, I think it's an active squirrel for them to come and say, oh well, we're only looking at stuff that actively does peer review anyways. Read the info slide. The Sokal paper was not peer reviewed. The only like metrics you should be looking at are the ones that don't peer review. This is something that Hanna tells you that squirrel must be bought. That is a squirrel, don't let them get away with it. The second response to this is just to say that peer review is an extremely subjective thing. It's a group of people, a group of scientists who've done a lot of work at a lot of time, sitting together and understanding what's happening in that paper and saying, ah, well, this is right or that is wrong. At this point of time, you literally have the government coming in and saying, oh, we have something that looks fake and we're going to call it fake, even if a bunch of scientists who know what the science is and understand what the scientists think it's right, we think the state is probably a better arbiter of that. They never give you any principled reason of why that's so. Hanna gives you reasons as to why the state cannot be the arbiter of that, which is why I think that's the second reason why OG and CG's case doesn't stand. But the third reason then is just to say, how exactly are they weaponizing this or mechanizing this? They never really tell you how you're going to stop people from doing peer review in this particular way in the first place. Because as I keep telling you, peer review is a very subjective thing. It's a group of people deciding whether this is fake or true in the first place, not the articles doing it. So the best they can still do is that even after peer review with its faults, maybe if they think it's a so-called paper, the articles then decide to not go forward and publish it even if you get peer review, which means you just break faith in peer review as a whole system, which is what OG and CG are actively going and trying to do. But we also seem to think that they seem to believe that peer review is pretty good. Like, the last response to this is also just that the delta in this is so low, right? Like, most things are caught by peer review in the first place. Neither side of government have really proved any benefit in this debate, which is why we think it's a debate that happens on the off bench. What are the 2 extensions we have in terms of closing off? Why do we come over to O? 2 things. The first is just to tell you that there's a value of having a space that doesn't really do peer review, right? We need a space that doesn't or even if it does peer review, it is not as stringent or as problematic as the ones that every other side of the house is seen to consensus. The biggest reason for this, and we get this from all sides of the house, is that a lot of minorities are actively pushed away from this, right? What does this necessarily mean? You lock out things like, say, queer rhetoric, you lock out things like, say, feminist rhetoric. But even more than that, get more granular into this, right? You lock out practices of, say, agriculture from African places, because that will never pass peer review because they don't have the prestige, the privilege, or the nepotistic power to actively go forward and get that out into this place in the first place. I have 3 mechanisms for this just to make it very structured. The first thing is just to say that a lot of these peer review practices are very nepotistic in a lot of these developing countries, which means, like, say, in India, it's probably all controlled by Brahmins, which means, like, say, when you say your caste surname, you're actively locked out from being able to publish from peer review in the first place, or even if you get peer review, they'll never look at that, right? Which is why you need a space that doesn't peer review. The second is just to say that a lot of times you can't really publish in international articles because the metrics of what really works in, like, say, India is very different from what it works in USA, which means you probably need, like, less peer review for you to be able to publish in international metrics. The third thing is just to say, like, Hanna's claim of, like, say, the punishing cycles that exist. I'm not going to talk about that more, but also for, like, say, this whole idea of, like, say, the methodology differences are largely weaponized by the West in order to prevent the ease from actually coming up in a lot of space. That's been discussed a lot. Why is this the most important thing in the debate, and why do we take individual within this? Simply because this outtakes every single person in this house, because talking about the most vulnerable actors, right? At least on our side of the house, you have an ability for you, if you're published in a journal, even if it's, like, not properly peer reviewed, even if it's not the most popular journal, at least someone's going to read that paper. Maybe Nature, an editor from Nature reads that paper, and because Nature has an incentive to have a good article published in it, if your article is good, they will actively extend invitations for you to come and then publish in Nature. There you get an active chance to be peer reviewed in a better place. You have better visibility already because you've already been published. More people know what's happening, and they probably realize that you're someone who has a good idea, which is why they're likely to put you there. The second extension that we have is why governments are bad, and this is way more important than whatever O tells you, because O's metric is well, lines are arbitrary. we actually come forward and mechanize why these lines being arbitrary are actively problematic, especially because in developing countries, they have their own ecosystem of academia. Like say for example in India, like some people actively believe that we had plastic surgery in like say 1500 BC. This is the kind of shit that they actively try to propose and push through. What are the impacts of this? Three different things. The first thing is just to say that when you don't necessarily know what a so-called paper is, when there's a liberal paper that's pushed, it's very easy for the government to just flip a switch and say, well, this paper is a so-called paper. Oh wow, you published that, that's probably bad. The second thing is what Hanna tells you, where you can retrospectively call a paper so-called, just to like punish people for doing it or not call it so-called or whatever else, a lot of shenanigans you can do there. But the third thing is you can now literally hold articles ransom, right? You can hold those papers ransom to punish, to push the kind of rhetoric you want at all points of time. Like hold them ransom and say, this is the kind of article we want printed. If you don't, we'll call your article so-called. We will punish you for shit like that. That's the kind of power governments now have on their side of the house. CG has literally one response to this, and that's to say, well, it's very easy for people to figure it out. But that's like knife by their own opening preemptively when they come here and tell you that governments have all the narrative and rhetoric power. At a point of time where governments can call something and provide legitimacy or not provide legitimacy, it's pretty fair to say when governments are likely, especially when like the government, like people generally buy into government rhetoric, it's probably very easy to understand that governments will hate this. Like, why is this another individual victory for us? This is really big in this debate because this takes over literally anything everyone has said in terms of quality of academia, right? Simply because you're actively breaking away integrity of academia, of the truth that comes out of academia, which is further upstream of any, like say, weird concepts of whether people believe in academia or not. But the second thing is just to say, I'll take a POI, sorry, I completely forgot about that.
So if this journal would already publish the paper, why would they now actively discriminate the author and block it following peer review? No, you don't need to do peer review to block a Sokal paper.
Wait, your claim is just to say that they're not going to block papers anyway? Like, isn't that like symmetric to our claim? I don't really understand what you're doing.
You can just like read the paper and realize it's inconsistent. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, like that just helps us anyways. If you can read these papers and realize that they're pretty bad, that's probably being taken care of on our side of the house. The problem on their side of the house is that's like a shit ton of these papers being provided and used in extremely nefarious ways to do this. That actually goes forward and flips your claim in the first place, right? Because at this point of time, the trust in academia comes down even more because the amount of shit that exists in academia and flows around in academia makes it so much more harder to understand what actually is happening in like what actually is not true, and it makes it so much more easier for governments to actively go forward and pick out what's the most important. What does OG give you? They give you three things. First, and why more accountability exists. We tell you why this accountability is bad because it's weaponized against minorities in every shape or form. They don't get that. The second thing, faith in institutions gets worse because you've got conspiracy theories running around, and even if you buy them at their best, the integrity of academia is probably more important than that faith. And the third thing on access, we tell you how access activity gets worse. Our case is pretty good against that. On OO, trust in academia, integrity is more important. Governments are actors, we make that out better for you. New research still happens, we just get like actual research that happens. CG, they give you two things, huge capital, that's probably bad, that's like an opportunity cost bad. And last thing, on like, you can't figure out so-called easily because government analytics. Extremely proud of those things.
Alright, thanks everyone for a very enjoyable and close debate. We had a good chat about it. What I'll do is give some general feedback, then the order, and then explain it. In terms of general feedback, I think the one salient piece of feedback that we had for all the teams in this debate was doing a much better job of impacting academia and generally the arguments you make, especially comparatively to other teams in the debate. I think there are a lot of times in this debate where we were in agreement that teams proved the sort of premises they were aiming to prove, but were unclear the significance that had, for example, for getting them over other teams, or even just what's the sort of real-world consequence of that argument is. So painting a clear picture of it, which I know is hard to do in debates about academia, but I think it would strengthen many teams' cases. And you can approach that any of us for feedback if you have further questions. In terms of the result, we very narrowly gave this debate as an opposition bench. So we gave the first to opening opposition, the second to closing opposition, the third to opening government, and unfortunately the fourth to closing government. Let's explain it. For the opening half, I will just go through.
Does anyone have a tissue?
I do, yeah.
Sorry.
No, all good.
Is it bleeding or just running?
No, just slutty.
For opening half, I'll just broadly go through it clash by clash because I think both teams in the opening half are contesting a lot of the same impacts a lot of the time. The first question then in opening half is the overall quality of the articles. And the thing I want to start with here is just how many Sokal article papers would get through the process i.e. how much of an imperative is there for the government to do this. Opening government gives three main reasons why it might be likely that a fair few Sokal papers would get through the process and why therefore there is a problem that would be solved. They say that currently there are just too many journals to look through, too many papers to look through, so journals have a profit incentive to just pick as many as you can because getting a lot of papers is good for you. Secondly, oftentimes the rep associated with the name of an academic means you let an article through when the content of it doesn't merit that. But thirdly, and also to just suggest that journals want a lot of papers. The panel agreed that opening opposition were able to quite solidly dislodge the idea that there was much of a need for this. And I will specifically note, opening government's setup, which explains that this debate is mainly about articles which are sort of just nonsense or don't have logical consistency. But you would still let through articles which are perhaps a little bit incorrect, but are at least like logically consistent. Does narrow the debate a lot and does narrow the imperative behind this government bench. But even if that wasn't the case, we think opening opposition were able to do a solid amount of characterization of journals to suggest that they have a very strong incentive to, for example, have a very high quality of papers that they let through, call each other out when there are low quality papers. But that incentive also applies to, for example, academics to critique other academics. And generally the people who are running the papers do care a lot about the integrity of academia. I will also note that we tended to agree with opening opposition that, for example, a lot of the problems with AI that our opening government wanted to talk about were, firstly, not as large as opening government wanted to claim, but secondly, were relatively easy to be mitigated through other forms of detection. It was unclear why you needed the Sokal papers. The consequence of that on the opening half clash then is it narrows the debate a lot in terms of the benefits that both teams can claim, but also obviously mitigates a lot of the benefit that opening government wants to claim of all these nonsense papers circulating around hurting academia. So then, what are each team able to claim on the quality of papers? Opening government do claim, I think, a small benefit about academics and journals being scared of punitive measures and therefore reviewing their papers more rigorously. But as we've already noted, I think this is probably the largest impact that opening government lands in this debate. But when evaluating this, I make two notes. Firstly, it's unclear how many of these nonsense papers there are around. But secondly, and this goes back to the general feedback, it could have been impacted much more strongly what the harm of even a few of these papers getting through. Which means although opening government do land that benefit of very slightly more rigorous peer review, it's not to the same extent they wanted to talk about. In terms of the quality of papers, opening opposition's main contention is that there are a series of times where you might present new ideas into this, new ideas into academia, and that you'd be less likely to do so because you're scared of the punitive measures. I think, again, evaluating this argument, I'd make two observations. Firstly, I think, given the opening government setup, the proof that opening opposition gives for it was not particularly responsive to the way the opening government narrowed the debate, which explains why I'm not clear when applying a burden of proof to this argument, why it is likely that an academic would be as scared as opening opposition want to claim of their new idea being rejected if it was a logical, well-cited and well-argued idea. So I'm unclear how much of a benefit opening opposition are able to claim on that mechanism. So TLDR, this clash about the overall quality of papers is a little bit of a wash in this debate. I don't think either team is able to get ahead very much here. I think opening opposition is able to claim a much bigger benefit on the clash of faith, and this is the main sort of impact that ends up winning the debate. On the issue of sort of faith in academia or trust in academia, opening government have one main mechanism here, which is that there currently is a problem in academia because there's all these sort of nonsense papers floating around and people perceive that that is a problem. I think it doesn't, that problem is then solved when the government says, hey, we're catching these papers out and we're fixing the problem. I think that doesn't get a direct response from opening opposition, but opening opposition are still able to handily win this issue through their own through, I think, the two main mechanisms they present. Firstly, that when a paper is passed through peer review and then is revealed as a Sokal paper, it has a contagion effect on the rest of academia, on the rest of that field, which means other academics in that field are hurt who may be doing legitimate work, they are less likely to get funding. But additionally, opening opposition is able to suggest that the perception of the government interfering in academia also limits trust in academia. I think some of opening opposition's bigger benefits that they go here, for example, about the government interfering a lot or directly manipulating this process in a way that favours them, is again hurt by, I think opening government are able to respond to that by, reasonably suggesting it's probably likely to be pretty independent, but I think there's still that perception of the government interfering in academia. So at the end of that, because of that contagion effect, because of the perception of government interference, opening opposition are able to get a pretty solid win on faith of academia, which I think is impacted by both teams in the opening half. It explains it has other impacts on funding, the extent to which academia sort of affects the rest of society. Lastly, there's a small clash on accessibility. I think opening government's arguments here could have been mechanized much more strongly about why particularly, their mechanism is that academics will be scared to write in jargon now because they believe that their Sokal paper will be rejected if it is. I think, again, opening government restricting the debate to mainly nonsense papers means if you were writing a paper using a lot of jargon, but you thought your argument was still good, you wouldn't have that incentive that opening government wanted to talk about. But secondly, even if you did, I think opening opposition are able to flip this by explaining that specificity in academia is good because it's useful that academia is niche, whereas the benefits that opening government wants to claim here aren't as exclusive because there are other ways to explain the ideas from academia. So that's why opening opposition win opening half. Let's now bring closing government into this debate. Closing government have mainly a contextual extension about the sciences, suggesting that that's where the delta in this debate really lies. And they provide, I think, perhaps actually the best examples in this debate about, for example, identifying the harm where the paper is published, I think better than opening government does. For example, in the instance of the paper about vaccines causing autism. But I think broadly when evaluating this extension, I would make two notes. Firstly, I think a lot of the mechanisms rely on opening or are quite derivative of opening. For example, although I agree it is a new context of the sciences, the fact that the incentive of journals and academics is still to avoid being punished by the Sokal mechanism and therefore to push new research is sufficiently explained at opening government, and therefore the mechanization for this sciences extension isn't sufficiently new at closing government. But secondly, the characterization that science is more black and white than the humanities, I think also does hurt the closing government case because it explains that that's also an area where the imperative of Sokal papers is less because the mechanisms of peer review would presumably be working better there by that characterization. So I think when weighing that against opening, I think on the metric of just sort of derivativeness or reliance on opening government, it's unfortunately closing government don't add enough new material here to get over their opening. But and additionally, when weighing them on the short diagonal, I think firstly, just through direct response, a lot of O's mechanization about why there's no imperative also applies to the closing government case, but also I think opening opposition is able to land a bigger benefit here. And in fact, in a POI, explain why specifically trust in science is very important. So even in the realm that closing government wants to talk about, I think opening opposition's benefit of faith is is strongly activated there, meaning OO are able to beat out CG on the way. Lastly, with closing opposition, they have two extensions, one about state influence and one about small institutions. I'll start this with the one about state influence, which I think is the weaker extension. I think the context of this is perhaps useful, but I will note that opening opposition firstly do make this argument in passing when they talk about how, for example, homophobic governments might limit queer, the publication of queer research in the DLO speech. But additionally, a lot of the same mechanisms for overall trust in academia come from opening opposition. I think it's still useful for amplifying the benefit that opening opposition want to claim and putting it in that context about the post-truth context or why it might be particularly likely that opening opposition get that benefit. But I think that more extreme example of governments using Sokal papers as sort of propaganda to control the rhetorics needed more explanation as to why those governments, for example, couldn't do it in other ways or why the Sokal paper system was a uniquely good vector for government propaganda. I think a much stronger extension, which comes out of closing opposition, which gets them over the government bench in this debate, is about smaller or subaltern academic institutions. I will note here, the mechanism is the same as opening opposition, which the panel agreed, which is that you have strong fear of the punitive measures that might be applied to a publication of this. I think when evaluating it, the panel noted that that does hurt the originality of this extension. but we're still willing to credit a number of new ideas about small institutions and how they might be particularly harmed by this, which is that they have less capacity to do what open government is talking about and clearly identify when some papers are Sokal papers. Then closing opposition explains that the impact of this is those small institutions have to tighten their belt. They are less able to publish those sorts of articles, and explain that this has an important benefit on the academics who work in these institutions who are unable to meet these criteria, but also the ideas that institutions publish. I will note, although that impact about new ideas is what opening opposition claim, I think I'm willing to credit that that is a sufficiently new mechanization because the mechanization applies to where the ideas come from as opposed to just the incentive of passing on the new ideas. Weighing that then against the rest of the debate, I think this is able to get them over closing government because it provides, I think, a bigger impact and a bigger explanation of why a lot of academics and academic ideas that we care about wouldn't exist on the government world, which I think is stronger than the closing government material about sciences. Then weighing on opening opposition bench, I think there are 4 reasons why opening opposition is able to come over closing opposition. Firstly, we think opening opposition is able to land a bigger and more well-impacted argument about faith, but is also able to claim some of the pool of the closing opposition impacts through their arguments about new ideas. But secondly, opening opposition is able to do, I think, a better job of mitigating the government bench and getting ahead of them on that point. Thirdly, that derivative, that reliance at times on the opening opposition mechanization, as I pointed out, hurts closing opposition. I think, those are the 3 reasons why opening opposition wins the debate. Lastly then, on the long diagonal, I think this was a very close split. I will make 2 notes. I think we get some good rebuttal from closing opposition explaining why the delta the opening government wants to claim is quite low in this debate. Again, pointing out that in the scenario where these are sort of mostly contradictory or nonsense papers we're talking about, the benefit they claim there isn't as big. But I think the important interaction is that the opening government claim that the Sokal papers they want to talk about, the opening government response in a POI to this closing opposition extension is, well, it's easy to identify which papers are Sokal ones and which ones are not, seems less plausible in the context that closing opposition want to talk about where these institutions or journals are perhaps more resource strapped or perhaps face other difficulties such as methodological differences, which explains why that response doesn't work. And then I think that benefit that CO is able to claim about academics and new ideas is more powerful than the more speculative benefits OG gets about slightly more rigorous peer review. So that's the upshot of the long diagonal, and that's the debate. Sorry for the long adjudication. Please approach me if you have any questions or any of the other panelists.